The human mind has a dangerous tendency. It doesn't always choose what's true. Under enough pressure, it chooses what feels safest. That sounds impossible. After all, if you're innocent, the truth should protect you, right? So let me ask you something. If I locked you in a room for 10 hours, told you I already knew you committed a murder, rejected every answer you gave, and convinced you the only way to go home was to tell me what I wanted to hear, would you confess? Most people answer that question immediately. No. They're certain. Because they're imagining themselves from the comfort of their own home, not from inside the room. The room changes everything. Inside that room, time stops making sense. Every minute feels longer than the last. Every denial sounds weaker than the one before. Eventually, your mind stops asking, "How do I prove I'm innocent?" It starts asking something far more dangerous. How do I make this end? That isn't weakness, it's psychology. History has shown that when enough pressure is applied, even innocent people can begin making decisions that make no sense from the outside. Tonight's story begins with a quiet 16-year-old boy who believed one simple thing. If he told the truth, he'd be allowed to go home. He was wrong. The boy who trusted the truth. In early 2006, 16-year-old Brendan Dassey walked into a police interview room in rural Wisconsin. He wasn't famous. He wasn't feared. He wasn't known for violence. Teachers described him as quiet. Family members said he usually followed instructions without argument. He struggled academically and often looked to adults for reassurance before answering even simple questions. If you met Brendan at school, you probably wouldn't have noticed him, which is exactly what makes what happened next so unsettling. Because by the end of the investigation, millions of people would hear Brendan calmly describe a brutal murder. The confession sounded convincing, detailed, emotional, specific. There was only one problem. Many of those details didn't match the physical evidence. So how does something like that happen? How does an innocent person reach the point where confessing feels more reasonable than continuing to tell the truth? To answer that, we have to understand something investigators, psychologists, and defense attorneys have spent decades studying. A confession doesn't begin with the words, "I did it." It begins much earlier. It begins the moment a person's goal quietly changes, not from guilt to innocence, but from truth to escape. And that's exactly where Brendan's interrogation began to change. The room where time stopped. Over the next several hours, Brendan was questioned, again and again. The investigators weren't simply collecting information. They already believed they knew what had happened. Their job had quietly shifted. Now they wanted Brendan to say it too. Whenever Brendan gave an answer that didn't fit, they challenged it. Whenever he guessed something closer to what they expected, they encouraged him. Without realizing it, Brendan began searching for the answers that made the questioning easier. Not the answers he remembered, the answers they seemed willing to accept. The room had changed him, not because he was weak, because he was human. Psychologists call this compliance. A person doesn't always confess because they believe they're guilty. Sometimes they confess because confessing feels like the fastest way to escape an unbearable situation. For a teenager, isolated from his family, desperate to please authority figures, that pressure becomes even more powerful. His goal was no longer to convince the investigators he was innocent. His goal was simply to make the room let go. When memory becomes suggestion. Watch Brendan's confession closely, and something unusual begins to appear. He hesitates. He guesses. He looks to the investigators for reassurance. Sometimes they correct him. Sometimes they guide him. Sometimes they tell him he's finally being honest. Each correction quietly teaches Brendan what kind of answer they're looking for. Over time, the interview stops becoming a conversation. It becomes a process of elimination. The wrong answers disappear. The acceptable answers remain. Psychologists have spent decades studying moments like these, not because they happen every day, but because they reveal something uncomfortable about memory. Memory isn't a video recording. It's reconstructive. Under stress, under authority, and under relentless pressure, people can begin doubting even their own recollection of reality. That's what makes false confessions so disturbing. They don't always sound forced. Sometimes they sound sincere. Brendan Dassey didn't confess because he suddenly became guilty. He confessed because, after hours of pressure, his goal quietly changed. He stopped trying to prove he was innocent and started trying to make the interrogation end. That's what prolonged psychological pressure can do. It doesn't always change what you believe. Sometimes it changes what feels worth fighting for. For decades, psychologists have studied false confessions because they reveal something deeply uncomfortable about the human mind. We like to believe that truth always wins, that if we're innocent, the facts will protect us. But inside an interrogation room, facts aren't the only thing your brain is processing. It's processing exhaustion, fear, isolation, authority, and the desperate hope that if you just say the right thing, this nightmare will finally be over. That's why this story isn't only about Brendan Dassey. It's about every one of us. Because confidence is easy when you're sitting safely in your own home. It's much harder inside the room. So maybe we've been asking the wrong question all along. The question was never, why would an innocent person confess? The real question is, how much pressure would it take before you did?